Okay, well, welcome to the start of our little day trip up the Clyne Valley onto Gower. We're going to start here at a very sort of modest place. You might see, why are we stopping on this rather sort of concretey bridge? Well, this is known as the Roman Bridge, and believe it or not, this bridge is actually a listed building. It was listed in 1993, and it's a grade 2, which means it's sort of seen as having heritage status. So you might think, Roman Bridge, heritage status, wow. Is this no, it's not a Roman bridge, don't get too excited. The Romans didn't build this. But it does date right back to the 18th century, so it does go back a fair old way, and it was an important probably crossing point for this little stream, this little river, the Clyne River that we're going to be looking at today. But the point of this starting here is that our talking about these sort of fairly modest types of places is very much one of the themes today. What we see in the valley when we go up through, or we won't see, is that there's lots of sort of stuff hidden away there, and it's understated. So, as I say, until fairly recently, I hadn't realised the significance of this bridge, and it's only just really come through in recent times. Okay, so that sense of sort of looking beneath the surface is one of the things I want to get through today and what I'm talking about. What we can also see in this location is across here, we can see a little micro park, a small sort of space. It's got a sort of public right-of-way that goes through it, connects to the cycle track that we're going to in a minute. And in the park there, you'll see there's a bench and a table and everything, and young people sort of gather there sometimes, and other people with picnics and things like that. So again, it's a very small space that you can easily just overlook. But of course, if you use that in any sort of regular basis, it's probably quite important to you. And it's another way which you can appreciate some of the quieter spaces. I mean, next to that main road is probably not very quiet, but there we go. Another issue, another theme here is up in that direction. There is a sort of Mill Valley sort of caravan park, which is a retirement centre basically. It's a whole series of sort of temporary, like caravan structures, and it's owned by a company that used to be the Swansea Bus Company of all things, but they own that now, and they rent out these buildings to retired people. We'll pass it when we go up the lane in a minute, up at the cycle track. But what's interesting is, although one of the things when they market it as being next to the Clyne Valley the cycle track there, you can't actually access it without coming out the end here and going around. There's no way across the river, there's no bridge or anything like that. So, again, that's an interesting sort of policy issue you might want to think about. But we'll come to the aims and objectives, the central aim and the purpose of this, the sort of coursework for this project at the next stop. Okay, well, I expect you're wondering by now what the overall aim of this project is. I don't expect you've read about it that much online, though it's all there, of course. So the aim of this project is you're going to write a 1,500-word strategic planning document or report that's going to set up 5 practical recommendations that you think need to be sort of put in place to sort of counter for the area that we're going to see today in our trip. That's going to be the Clyne Valley, bits of the Clyne Valley Country Park, and also bits of Gower, an area of outstanding natural beauty. So it's a fairly straightforward aim, but obviously these 5 recommendations, they have to be sort of backed up with sort of reasonable evidence and things to support them, so they actually could be carried through in practice there. The recommendations should be rooted in the past and the present and maybe the future use of this land, so you need to think about that. They should focus on managing and enhancing, maximising the area's benefits for the social needs, leisure, heritage and conservation. And of course, all those issues together, can they be reconciled? Can they sort of go together, or do they sometimes contradict each other? And therefore you'd have to make some quite hard decisions as to which direction to take these things in. That's one of the big challenges today. Is something like a country park is not just about leisure, it's about these other sort of intentions as well, with heritage and what have you there, and conservation issues, as we'll see today. So the priorities then can often contradict, and so balancing is often a key underlying challenge. The recommendations, though, that you put must also be very explicitly aware of the value of being a country park, and also later on the value of being an area of outstanding natural beauty. And also when we get onto Gower, there's issues of common land as well. I'll step into it a little bit. So all those things have to be brought together, but you need to come up with a report with 5 recommendations. Okay, well, welcome to the start of the Clyne Valley Country Park. And I'm sure you can all admire this very impressive introductory sign. It gives you a lot of sort of really friendly sort of welcome, and tells you a lot about what you're going to experience, and sort of gives you real confidence this is going to be a top quality space. The Clyne Valley Country Park, though, it's not a one-off, it's not an unusual thing. There are around about 250 of them in England and Wales, and overall about 60 million people visit these parks every year. So they're sort of a big deal, they're a big sort of network, set up, as I'll talk about in a minute, under legislation that came in after the war. But just to introduce you, this is where the start of our sort of main sort of drag is, so to speak. And please note here the facilities, the car park over there. So there is some facilities here, though a lot of it's simply blocked off with a fence. And you get across the road here, there's some basic shops and a restaurant and things like that. And then, of course, there's the beach and everything that goes with that. So it's a really good location just outside of Swansea, as you can see. But maybe its starting point is not quite as impressive as it might be. There's some signs just behind us there, which are talking about the cycle track. But not that much, really introducing the whole Clyne Valley itself. Just a bit up there, there's the old railway station, because this used to be a railway line, something I'll be talking about a bit later on. But the old railway station, it's just a sort of series of steps and things. There's nothing really sort of making it very distinctive. Okay, we'll move on to the next stop now, so get on our bikes and let's get up the hill past the station. As we came up here, we passed those retirement cottage shelters, place in it, and notice how that development has sort of come up the valley a little bit. There's some older houses here that have been redeveloped as well, but clearly one of the pressures would be on a valley like this for development. And they say the retirement cottages really quite eat into the sort of valley a little bit here, but that's the sort of pressure coming up from the south there. But the first thing I want to talk to you about here is to do with the industrial heritage of this valley. Because you might not think it now when we go up through it, it's all very quiet and beautifully green and all that sort of thing, but it certainly wasn't always like that. And we're not talking Copperopolis, we're not calling that scale, but nonetheless this area was it was a very important industrial area. And the first thing I want to talk about, reference to that, is for you to think about, just look at this area behind me here and think, well, what does it look like to you? Probably looks like a bit of sort of rather not that well maintained, a bit of woodland, with quite a steep hill and everything like that. It is all that, but it's also got quite a lot of industrial relics and remains on it, believe it or not. And we can't see it here, but if you're going a bit further back, and you wouldn't be able to see it if you were there at any rate, there's actually the remains there of a mid-19th century arsenic works. Arsenic, we know what that is, pretty dangerous stuff, poisonous stuff, very polluting stuff. What was happening in the mid-19th century, they were bringing in arsenic ore from Devon and Cornwall, from across the water, bringing it into Blackhills at the bottom there, transporting it up to this place, smelting it with coal, and we'll get to the whole point of coal in a minute, and producing a degree of arsenic. The works didn't stay here very long because the big families, the Swansea families of the Vivians and others, were moving into the area. And if you moved into this area and you were rich, would you want a big sort of arsenic smelting works right in your back garden? No. So they got it shut down, but it didn't completely shut down. It relocated. And to tie in with your other field trip, where you go to Copperopolis, where do they relocate it to? The east of Swansea, the industrial areas. So they took it away from where they were living, relocating it to where all the other polluting stuff was going on. So in other words, there's a heritage site of this arsenic works in the woods up there. I still haven't found it myself yet, but I will get there one day. But one thing you can find of it, which was too far to go today, is up the top of the hill, when you go up Mill Lane, where we started, where the Roman Bridge and things was. If you go right to the top of the hill there's a sort of ruined tower on the footpath. That was actually the sort of like the chimney of the arsenic works. The sort of arsenic, the fumes from all the work would go up, was channeled underground up to this tunnel, up to this tower, and then it all floated out the top of the tower. But when the whole thing shut down, the Vivian families, they didn't want to knock the tower down. They converted it in the style of the 19th century into a Gothic sort of folly, to make it look like it was this old ruined tower. And they go out there probably and have a few drinks and go up and stand on top and wave and stuff. And they would wave because there was another big rich family the other side, near where we're going when we go to the National Nature Reserve, who had another tower, and they probably have somebody there waving as well. So it was all interconnected. So the whole sort of industrial thing was almost sort of denied in many ways overnight. But as we'll hear today, here and elsewhere, it has a massive sort of legacy for this area. Okay, so I'm talking about the arsenic works using coal. So where do they get the coal from? No, they didn't bring it down from the Welsh valleys where famous mines would subsequently develop. Instead, most of the coal they used, certainly for the arsenic works, and also for much of the other early industry in this area, actually came from the valley itself. And you'd never believe it, but just over here, right in front of you there's a former site of a coal level, as it was called. And there's a little canal that goes along there. You can see that if you sort of dig into the area quite a bit. There's quite a bit of water there, and there's a sort of canal-y structure. But it's not very well marked or marketed in the way you want to put it, really. But this is a very important archaeological site for the fact it was this 19th century and earlier coal level, but also for the fact that it's argued that a lot of the lessons about how coal mining developed, when, for example, the Cornish came over and helped out, those sorts of things were in many ways were pioneered in places like this, because the coal mines were not the big mines with all the sort of, you haven't got all the wheels and all the stuff you get from the sort of stereotypes of the Welsh mines or the Yorkshire mines from the, say, 20th century. Instead, they basically just dug a great hole into the side of the hill, and of course a steep hill like this, they digged right in, brought the coal out. Very dangerous, very difficult, but nonetheless the early coal was used for this sort of industrialisation of this area. And this certainly wasn't the only site. There's loads of sites through this wood. It's very hard to find them unless you've got a really good map. Sometimes you can tell there's a bit of sort of a mound of sort of waste there, because they've all, just about all of them, I think, have collapsed now. So, and also if they're not, they'll be blocked off, so sort of health and safety issues. But nonetheless, coal mining was a big deal in this valley for a little while. Okay, so the valley actually had quite a large number of these pretty small scale coal mines where they sort of dug into the ground, they propped it up a bit, I suspect, they dug in until they couldn't find any more, then they just basically abandoned them, and most of them collapsed. When you go looking through the woods for these mines, it's very difficult to find unless you've got a really precise map, and there aren't many of these around. But what you see sometimes are mounds on the surface, and that's some of the waste that came from the mines is sort of left there. And there's sort of clues there, but the whole point being this was a quite sort of early industrial area that was picked up on by the sort of industry that fed into the Copperopolis that you're doing in your other project. Okay, well, I want to say a few words now about bikes and cycling, because this is a big deal basically in this area, in everything we do today. It's not just me coming on my bike, you'll see lots of other bikes around. So the first thing to point out is the fact that this route that we're going up here, this former railway line, is National Cycle Route number 4. And this is a whole network of cycle tracks that were put in place in the early 2000s, supported and funded through the charity Sustrans. And this is a really extensive network. 40% roughly is traffic free, and they cover all sorts of, right across the sort of British Isles. And this is just one of them. This one goes all the way from London to Fishguard. So if you got a few days to spare and you got a lot of energy, more than I have, you could cycle all that way. And it's probably fairly typical, probably about 40% of it would be traffic free. Some of it would be smaller roads generally. So in other words, now it is used by these long distance cyclists, but of course it's also an absolutely perfect cycle resource for the people of Swansea to come and use. And you'll see all the time it's used pretty heavily, especially of course in the summer and things like that. It's well signposted, well marked out, as Sustrans and National Cycle Tracks generally are. Maybe a bit of a contrast with the whole sort of layout of other aspects of this country park. And so you'll see lots of bikes going up there. Now, clearly an issue there is if there's lots of bikes, or even there's bikes going very fast, which some of them do, that can be a sort of an issue of sort of conflict with other users, pedestrians, people with children in buggies and stuff, or running around live dogs and things like this. So there's potential there for tensions, shall we say, put it mildly, and conflict in these issues. So you need to think maybe an issue there is how to manage that sufficiently. We don't tend to segregate the bikes and the walkers. That was attempted a while back, but that's not really, I don't think that's the way forward, and I think that's generally seen that way now. Now, the sort of bikes that use the cycle track tend to be the ancient bikes like mine, but also sort of racing bikes, those sort of things, also just ordinary bikes that ordinary people use. But there's another big group of cyclists who use this area, this country park, considerably. That's people with BMX bikes and other off-road bike type situations. For them, well, they do use the main track probably to get here, but they're not really interested in that because it's not dangerous enough, not muddy enough, not wet enough. So what they've got across the hill behind us, but in particular up on the hills here, are lots of different cycle routes, lots of different tracks. They tend to be quite well signposted, and they're often places you don't really want to walk because they're very steep and muddy and quite dangerous. But again, it's another group that can create a degree of tension, in the sense they can be accused of like erosion on the sort of the sides of the hills. There's the issue of sort of danger, both to themselves of course, but also to other people if they sort of go and crash into you or anything like that. And the sort of the way in which the paths cut into the landscape can be seen as a bit of a big deal. But nonetheless, they're a very prominent group in the area. If you go up, you can soon see their paths. There's also, they have a number of meeting points, and I've been to one of those. It's a bit further along, further away up the path. And that one's fine. It's nice for them to meet up, but I did notice how much litter there was there, absolutely covered in all sorts of cans and bottles and plastic stuff. And that can be another an issue of problem in the area. But nonetheless, BMX bikers, big presence in the area. They have lots of facilities in this area, and it's a very popular place for them to come to. Okay, well, you see I'm at a bit of a junction here. The cycle track's just up here. Then down here's the river, and you see another route, another path. And then there's a path going through the woods there. And this is it's an important early junction on the path, because if you go through there, you get to a sort of children's play area. It's got a big slide. There's also a car park there to allow people to access this whole route. Interestingly, it's locked at night. You can think why that might be the case, but I won't go there. And so there's a big sort of play area there. There's also a bit further next to it, there's a big recycling centre. One of the main recycling hubs for the Swansea area is where you bring your stuff, or the council bring the stuff for the recycling. So again, it sort of pressures on the edge of this country park from sort of, well, leisure users, but also from the demands of trying to sort of be more sustainable, I suppose you'd say. So we need to sort of think about how that can be managed. Then there's also the whole sort of route here, the cycle route, the bridge itself, how that's maintained. And this is quite a sort of congested area, it can be at times. Okay, well, I'm standing right on the cycle track here because it's a significant boundary, because everything that side of it is part of the Gower Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty. The first of the Area of Outstanding Natural Beauties that was set up in 1956 to basically promote conservation, but also to promote enjoyment, and to some extent later on to recognise the sort of the lives of the people who live in those areas. So that side's the AONB, this side is still part of Swansea. And they've got different planning regimes and things associated with them, but it's hard to tell just by looking at them what they're about. Another thing here, of course, is that side of the path, it's got a lake. It's quite a deep lake. It's largely, again, it would be largely artificial, the lake. But today, of course, it's used for fishing. You have to have a licence to fish there. And there's always people here fishing. So another user of this area, another of the many users of this area. It's not a place to go swimming. I don't think I've ever seen anyone swimming in there. It's warnings. It's quite deep. It's quite dangerous apparently, but nonetheless, it's still used for fishing and other activities like that. Okay, so we're off the old railway line a little bit now. We're at a big bridge that crosses the line. This is a very important sort of junction. There's quite a lot of paths that sort of interact here, so it's quite a busy sort of route. But you might want to notice there's no signposts or anything telling you the different directions or anything like that. It's sort of, you have to sort of know it really to appreciate it. Luckily plenty of people do, so they use it, but it's not sort of laid out, and the surface of the bridge is a bit, it's muddy today, but I've seen it much worse than this in the past. It can be quite a nightmare. Now, just wanted to say a couple of words here about the state of the condition of the railway. The railway was established in about 1840s there. And it wasn't just a sort of minor railway, it's part of the whole Heart of Wales line. Some of you may know today the Heart of Wales line going from Llanelli right up into England there. It's a really beautiful route, and if you haven't been on it, I strongly recommend it, I hasten to add. But in the 19th century, this was a major sort of industrial route, and this was a significant railway line. Just to reinforce its significance, you might think, in the Second World War, they built along the railway line a number of pillboxes, defensive structures, and we see one here just behind me, which showed that there were people there prepared to sort of, they thought the Germans might be attacking it, and so they're going to sort of defend it somehow or other. Today these pillboxes are abandoned and not really supposed to go in them, so I think they're important for bats and things like that to live in there. But there's still, I think there's 3 or 4 of them around alongside of the railway line itself. Another issue you can see quite handily here is looking into this field. There's a lot of these very marginal fields on the edge of the it's part of the country park, and also of course there's AONB. And you want to think what they're used for today. They're not used for very much, as you can probably see. There's nothing in there at the moment. If they're used for anything, it's probably horses and horsiculture, as it's called, a theme that will be taken up much more significantly when we get onto the bits of Gower a bit later on. But you might want to think about, if you're the farmer who owns this field, what you're actually going to do with it. You can't really do much commercial with it. It's a quite rough field, but nonetheless it's still sort of functioning somehow or another. Another final issue from this on top of the bridge here is to sort of note over that way, and it's a bit muddy, we can't really go over there at the moment, but there's a large quarry, a former quarry there, which you can sort of walk around. Obviously there's some safety issues there with the drops and stuff, but nonetheless it shows how this area again was used for quarrying. I think it's probably building stone more than anything else that was quarried there, but nonetheless it's a pretty substantial site that now has got quite a good conservation for sort of plants and animals and things that are living down in the quarry. It's quite a significant one for that sort of stuff. So again, another of these sort of fairly innocuous sites, fairly ordinary sites, but it sort of interlinks a whole host of different uses, priorities, importances for the future. Right, well, again, we're just below the bridge here, but if we look just sort of to the northeast to some extent, it's a little bit too far to walk, but it's not too far, it's not really very far, it's just a bit muddy and what have you. And that was the site of a number of brickworks, because another of the industries that was in this valley were the manufacture of bricks for the sort of building and building of Swansea generally. And if you walk through a lot of that woods now, you'll soon come across, stepping on some of them, you'll see them there with the sort of their distinctive markings and things. So that was another series of industry, and it was supported by things like branch lines for the railway and the sort of these canals, the remnants we can find there in the woods. It's an important employer, and it went from around about the 1870s right through. They're still manufacturing them in the 1960s. And indeed, the bricks that were used to manufacture, sort of help to manufacture Swansea Airport that we'll get to at the end of the day, were actually manufactured locally. So brickworks are another sort of important industry in the area. If the brickworks weren't enough, not far from where the brickworks are located, from the sort of late 1860s right through to the sort of 1920s or so, there was a race course, believe it or not. Actually, horse racing was undertaken in the Clyne Valley. The site is just up there, and it wasn't an insignificant location at all. In 1910, they had an event where something like 8,000 people came along to watch this horse racing. A lot of them apparently came on the trains, and they got off at the station up here, just near the pub just up here, and they'd just walk into the race course. So it was a big deal, basically. So just think about all the different uses that the valley's been made of in the past, and what you might think, well, can we go and visit the race course today? Well, we're not going to walk up there, partly because it's muddy, but also if you got there, you can't really see anything, because in the 1930s, Swansea Council was using that as a dumping ground for its waste. And a lot of this valley was used for dumping waste in, as we'll hear about a bit more later on. And that was the sort of purpose that was seen for these sort of sites in the sort of certainly in a lot of the 20th century, until a relatively recent time when we started to value these things much more, and the creation of the country park and all these sorts of things. But nonetheless, there's amazing pictures you can find online of the racecourse. It was a serious sort of place for gambling and meeting people and socialising, what have you. Just a sort of racecourse that was set in place there. One of the challenges for managing the country park today, and for this route, this pathway in particular, is to make sure that the vegetation is not all falling across it, and it's sort of management. And what we see when we pass up this track, certainly just through the bridge here on the right and on the left, we'll see that the council workers have been there cutting the trees, tidying things up, doing it. So it's quite a lot of work is basically needed to maintain the state of this track. And that's something to be borne in mind in terms of the work that has to be invested in these things. Okay, well, I've got my bike just down there because I'm not going to go cycling around this, because this is a BMX pump track. And it's right next to the railway line, the old railway line, the path. So we've just turned off it, and it's literally like a minute's off site, just by near the pub that we go past. And it's something that's been installed in this area very, very recently, last few years. I don't know the exact date of it yet, but it's a very new facility. It's getting a lot of good reviews from BMX people, and it's used quite a lot by them and also by, as it is today, by young children and other people just sort of on scooters and stuff like that. But you can think about it as another type of land use, another type of leisure land use within the country park. You know, and what we'll see in a minute, it's right up against the nature reserves that I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes. And so it's juxtaposed on that, right next to the actual cycle track itself. Also behind it, they've also put in a really quite new and a very well maintained path that facilitates access to nearby communities of Calais and what have you, but also can arguably opens up this space, and it can be seen as quite controversial for walkers, maybe conservationists, the sort of level of access that's being created here. But again, that touches on another issue, which is the level of access that the whole country park has, and being as good as possible to as many people as possible is one of the aims of that designation. So to allow people who are able to walk, what have you, to get access to the park is very, very important. And indeed, further up the park, up the lane here at Dunvant, up the cycle track a bit further on, there's actually a facility now a charity their base. They're trying to open these spaces for disabled people, and they have a variety of disabled bikes and things that have been adapted to facilitate access to disabled people. So that big challenge of opening the country park to all interests and all users is very much there, but of course it's a challenge to actually bring all those users together sometimes. Okay, so we're here now at a local nature reserve, just on the very edge of the local nature reserve. And this was something that's been set up relatively recently. And it's a very sort of wet, marshy habitat, with all sorts very good for amphibians and other sorts of fairly rare species and things like that. But what's another particularly interesting issue to do with this local nature reserve is until the 70s and 80s, just further up the valley, but nonetheless it sort of touched on this area, it was used as a sort of waste dump. So the idea, particularly we talked about 1937 earlier on, is when they started to dump waste where the old horse racing track was. And the whole idea, I suppose, of these sorts of spaces in the sort of mid-20th century, even towards the late 20th century, they were just seen as waste spaces, no longer of any use particularly, and they just sort of think they're a good place to get rid of your rubbish and dump your rubbish. But attitudes started to change, particularly towards the end of the last century, end of the 20th century. And certainly in 1992, early 1990s, the local residents particularly campaigned to stop this all this waste dumping happening and to turn this area into a nature reserve, which it was. And in 1993, Bass Brewery, of all people, they gave something like £5,000 to invest in access facilities for this area, so people could also get to this reserve as well as actually experience it. And so today this is now seen as quite an important sort of habitat, because this sort of wet, marshy type of landscape is often quite threatened, and so it's a very important habitat. We're not going to really go into it, you have to sort of go up and around, but it's the whole sort of space between here and actually where Dunvant Rugby Club is another matter further up the path there. Right, well, just literally, if a minute's walk from the BMX place or 30 seconds walk from that sign for the nature reserve, we see we're another space here of children's playgrounds, quite a few facilities, and also a fair bit of open grassland. This time of the year pretty boggy and wet, but in the summer be nice and dry, and people could play on it and have picnics and things like that. So it really epitomises all these different sort of land uses coming together. They're all right juxtaposed onto each other. The play zone being right next to a nature reserve. Inevitably children and teenagers, what have you, are going to go into the edge of the reserve and do their stuff, which is not always as good to the environment as it maybe should be. Having two teenage boys, I know what that's like. So that you can think about different complex of interests that we find in these sorts of areas. And again, slightly controversial, there's been an investment here in a very good quality path that leads you from the edge of sort of Calais there onto the cycle track, which makes it very accessible. There's an old path there before, but now it's one that you can access with buggies or in disability aids and things like that. And so everybody can access from Calais into the cycle track. Controversial because in some ways, again, it's right next to a nature reserve. Is it opening up those spaces for uses maybe that are not very appropriate for those locations? So again, this really epitomises some of the tensions and issues here. And just to reiterate, the community over here, Clyne, largely residential community now for Swansea, of course, but it is history actually built on coal mining. I talked about the coal seams and things, digging into the side of the hills and things before. There were a lot of sort of mines in Clyne and in Dunvant further on, small scale ones, but helped to sort of explain the initial boost to growth for these areas. But if you go there now, you hardly realise there's anything like it. Okay, well, welcome to the Railway Inn, which is described by that fine source whatpub.com as a classic locals pub with occasional activities outside in the summer particularly. Obviously it's a bit quiet today because it's shut with the lockdown, but it's a pub that sort of stood the test of time in the sense it was set up around the time of when the railways, about a few years onto the railways in the 1860s, it was established, and it's maintained its presence ever since. Now, if you're coming here on the trip, hopefully we can actually go inside the pub and you can see what its facilities are like. It's apparently, the camera call it a 3 rooms and passageway pub, which is a distinctive sort of historical design, which is quite sort of old but typical, I guess, of the 19th century. So it's got quite a lot of heritage value in itself. It's not just because it sells some fine beer, which it does, but it's actually it's got a quite high historical value. Clearly it's shut at the moment, but it does get quite busy here in the summer. Certainly people sitting outside, and it's quite interesting inside to see. The one thing to note really is to think about how much facilities there are here, because this is really the only, on the whole cycle track that certainly we're going to cover today, this is the only pub or facility that's really actually on the track itself. And so it's got quite a distinctive sort of sense like that. How much that is appreciated is another matter. Okay, so we're here along, this is Gower Road, one of the main roads onto Gower itself, and it gets extremely busy, especially during, obviously, in the summer when the tourists are really, so that, I mean, that's an issue, the traffic and the congestion that causes. In our little trip today, we're about to turn off the road. We're following the bikes that just gone around the corner, heading into a quieter area. But I just wanted to sort of stop here and mention a couple of things here, because Gower Road is a reasonably good example of what's known as sort of ribbon development, where basically a strand of houses were built out of the urban area into the countryside, in typically the early part of the 20th century. That was one of the sort of things that really stimulated the growth of the planning system in the post-war years, the feeling that was sort of making cities and big urban areas look in many ways artificially big, because they got these long tentacles, and they often use that sort of metaphor, tentacles going out into the sort of nature, into the countryside. Today, though it's quite a sort of nice part of Swansea to live, they're quite expensive houses. You'll be pleased to know that one of my colleagues, Marcus Dole, lives just around the road there, though he doesn't live in a particularly fancy house. But what happens, you see, with these properties is, and we saw it hopefully when we came up the hill there, when they get if they get demolished or they get refurbished, or if a bit of land that hasn't been developed gets allowed to be developed, then what we see is often the development of a sort of posher version that was what one was there before, and certainly you can see that on this road. So in other words, it's sort of gentrifying, it's upgrading in many ways all the time to make the houses more sophisticated, so to speak. Okay, well, we've just come off on Hen Park Road, come off Gower Road into a sort of very quiet little lane that sort of bends around here, and we've just come off the lane a little bit up the hill, and it's really close, of course, to the built-up part of Swansea, but it also seems in many ways distant and cut off. And where we are here, on the one hand you get some amazing views, and you can see particularly the views over that way, but you can see almost the majority of Swansea from here, some very sort of distant parts, and looking the other way behind you can also see some towards the sea and towards Mumbles, there's also tremendous views. So you can imagine that if this was sort of free market on the market, this would be a prime sort of development site because it's quiet, out the way, and it's got these amazing views. It's not on the market, partly because it's on the area of outstanding natural beauty, but also because we're actually on 2 golf courses at the moment. We're sort of stuck. We're on one of them, which is the Clyne golf course, I think it's called, and then there's the one just literally over the road, which is a Fairwood Park golf course. And in fact, Gower itself has got about 7 or 8 golf courses, depending how you define them exactly. And it's a major sort of land use issue for the area. And the golf courses themselves raise questions about how they're used. There's the sort of obviously the land that the golf courses take up, which is quite a lot of land, but also their use of water, the type of plants they're allowed to grow there, the type of sort of plants and animals and things that are allowed to sort of exist there, and of course all issues of social exclusivity and what have you. Somewhere like this particular golf course so has public rights of way through it, so they have to keep those open, so you can sort of walk through if you're prepared to avoid risk being whacked in the head with a golf ball, but that's another matter. This quiet little place though, this quiet little area that we're going to go through now, it's got a lot of stuff going on in it. We've got the golf courses for one thing. We've got plenty of other leisure uses though. We've got a lot of footpaths going through here. This is very typical for a place like Gower, area of outstanding natural beauty or a bit of upland areas, but nonetheless these paths have to be kept open, they have to be maintained, there's issues associated with them, with muddiness and what have you. Horsiculture is a big deal in this area. The people having horses, usually locally stabled, coming out onto the paths, onto the roads to some extent when they're quiet. Often that lane, Hen Park Road's often got horses. I've been down it a few times and there's always seems to be horses coming down there. Some of the routes even across this golf course here is actually a bridle way, which is a public right of way where horses are also allowed to travel on. And that's fantastic, but of course when it's wet and muddy they make an awful lot of mess to those paths, so making it for walkers like myself for example more difficult to get through and very often not very pleasant. But nonetheless, horses is a big deal, stabling is a big deal in this area. There's also just down the road here, which we'll pass in a minute, a kennels and cattery. And that's sort of located out of the city centre because obviously they're quite noisy places, but it's been here since about 1980, and again it's somewhere you can sort of take your pets when you're going on holiday. There's a whole variety of other facilities and services in this area that I'll get to in a minute. Okay, I said there's an awful lot going on here. I forgot a couple of things just now. There's also a nursery here, that's not for little kids, but a nursery for plants. And there's also a very interesting, sort of very eco-conscious cafe down here, which on the trip day when we go out, we're hoping to go to, but depending if it's open or what have you. But that's a fairly recent, a fairly new development in the area, and very much tailoring it to sort of the green consumer, the ecological sensitive consumer, the sort of people they imagine are particularly coming to these sort of areas for walks and things like that. And it's connected to walk paths and things like that, and the Ramblers local group bring walks around here as well, and all these sorts of things going on. So this is seemingly a quiet area, but lots and lots of different uses trying to make the best of it. And we'll see a couple more when we go down that way in a minute. We'll stop looking at this big sort of caravan park, for example. We're going to stop by and have a look at that. So it's a quiet area, but underneath the surface, one of the themes today really, there's an awful lot there, an awful lot going on. And this for this type of AONB type location near a big city like, well, reasonably big city like Swansea, that's not atypical. This urban fringe is under a lot of pressure for different developments in different directions. That's one of the things you've got to try and manage and think about in this assignment. So we've just come down the road a little bit from the 2 golf courses. It's just on the edge of them there. And there's a few sort of houses dotted about here. We've passed where the cafe was. We've passed, I think, where the nursery is, and I think the cattery's made a bit further on, but it's near here at any rate. But what we've come down to here is on the corner here, and through behind me, you can see actually it's quite a large-scale caravan park. So in other words, this is yet another use of this area for sort of mass tourism in that sense. Quite a sizable Blackhills caravan sort of park development. So in other words, in the summer again, it's particularly busy here, lots of families and things coming to stay here in these locations. So you've got that form of mass tourism, and then in 1 or 2 of the buildings across the other side of the road, there's also bed and breakfast going on there, so much more small scale, much more individual sort of activities. So again, it's sort of reinforcing just how many multiple uses there are for this seemingly very quiet, very nondescript piece of sort of edge of city sort of landscape. All sorts of stuff going on here, and certainly in the peak times in the summer it can be very, very busy in places like this. And so you might think, well, where are people going to park and things like that? Well, as we've seen from the big bend all the way down, there's very little sort of official car parking space. There's a few sort of rough bits of parking next to the golf course there, which we had to use just now and things like that. But there's not many facilities for sort of large-scale visitors in that sense. Clearly, if you're staying in the caravan park, you've got parking in there. But otherwise, those sorts of basic facilities can be quite pressing when it comes certainly to peak times, like in the summer and times like that. So again, all these issues coming up in a fairly, well, not being rude about it, nondescript sort of area on the edge of the city here. Okay, well here we are at the end of our little journey. This is Swansea's fine airport, which is still operative as an airport to some extent, mainly with small private planes and helicopters, but the police and that are also able to use it. So it's still an active airport. As an airport, it was built during the Second World War. It was built quite quickly during the Second World War for wartime uses. But equally, it was soon sort of the Royal Air Force didn't want it after the war. In 1949, they withdrew from it, and in 1957 it was taken over in a more commercial operation that started having some sort of local flights that people could sort of pay for. Between the late 40s, early 50s, it was just sort of used for private uses, I don't know, very, very small scale. Remember I said earlier some of the bricks we used to make the initial airport came from the Clyne Valley there, so there's a connection to where we've been before. So let that tractor go. So 1957, taken over, and it was very small scale, but then it was in the early 2000s, about 2001, a big investor came in, and briefly, for about 3 years, it was open for international flights to places like Cork, Amsterdam, London. Well, it's not international, well, some people might see it that way, but some more serious flights. But it didn't pay off economically, and so this investor withdrew, and now it's, I say, a much more small scale operation. But again, the very presence of something like an airport in an area of outstanding natural beauty can clearly raise a lot of sort of controversy, shall we say. This is in some ways reinforced by the fact that almost surrounding the airport is a special area of conservation. So even within the AONB, there's certain bits of it that are given extra status, extra designated status for the types of plants and animals and things that they find there. And the airport is sort of stuck in the middle of that, so to speak. There's also a path, I think, that goes around it, because this is also very much open access land. And in fact, a lot of this land on Gower is common land, a historical form of land ownership that goes way back, and commoners have particular rights to usually graze their animals and get various crops and other things from that land. It's also land that's covered by public access legislation. In 2000, the Common Rights of Way Act was passed, and that opened up a lot of spaces to public access. Common land generally is open to public access, as is sort of moorland areas. So that makes a lot of Gower today public access. You can walk on it. You're not supposed to camp on it. You're not supposed to light fires on it. You're not supposed to drive and park on it, but you're allowed to walk through it. And we're coming out there. So we've come from a sort of a country park where, there's plenty of access, but they're mainly on paths and things, to an area where there's actually much more open access. Having said that, if you look around you, this is a very wet area. There's a lot of these areas you probably don't want to walk through at any rate. They're almost intractable, but nonetheless, it is open access issues. Well, this is the end of our little excursion, our little trip. I'm just going to pop in there and get in my helicopter and fly back home. Oh no, I can't do that. I've still got my bike with me, haven't I? So I'm going to be cycling back now, and if you're coming on the trip with me, you'll be also going back. But I just want to thank you all for coming along today and seeing a bit of particularly the country park, but also hopefully seeing a little bit of the area of outstanding natural beauty, and to think about that it's all urban fringe area, all the edge of the city, and just to think of all the challenges that planners and other people responsible for these fringe areas are, how they manage the different interests, because all these interests arguably are very many ways are very positive. People want to use it for different reasons, different healthy reasons sometimes, and for nature and for access. But of course, managing it all together is a real big challenge. So your assignment then is to think about 5 ways, 5 priorities, 5 policies that we put in place to try to make this challenge a bit less daunting, you might say. But thank you very much for coming with me, and I'll see you all back in the lecture theatre maybe one day, but certainly back at the university. Thanks very much.